The camera footage was captured on a Tuesday night in late October. The property sits in Price County, Wisconsin, on a rural county road south of Ogama, where the last strip of cleared agricultural ground runs out and the wall of northern hardwood and balsam fir begins. The man who owns this land has walked that tree line thousands of times over the course of his life. He knows the drainage patterns on both sides of it. He knows which sections of the ridge concentrate deer sign in November and which creek hollows the bears work in late summer. He knows the timber as you only know land you have been reading since before you were old enough to drive. And until 6 weeks before he contacted this channel, he believed he understood everything that lived out there. The footage his camera captured that night is the clearest record of a Dogman encounter this channel has ever received. We have reviewed a considerable amount of footage over the years: trail camera clips, dash cam recordings, phone video shot with shaking hands at the edge of a forest road at 2 in the morning. Most of it asks you to lean in and decide for yourself what you believe. A large shape, wrong proportions, movement that does not match anything in the field guides. This footage does not ask you to lean in. It shows a large bipedal animal crossing an open field toward a wooden fence post, stopping at that post, and standing there for over 4 minutes without moving. It does not circle. It does not investigate the wire or the boards. It does not look toward the forest behind it or test the air. It stands with its head oriented toward the farmhouse across the yard, completely still, watching. And if you have spent any time at all looking into Dogman encounter reports, the intentional quality of that behavior will do something to you that is hard to shake. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. The footage came to us in November. The email arrived through the channel's contact address, and the subject line was direct. 3 generations, same property, same animal. The man who sent it had been following this channel for a couple of years before he reached out, and he was not someone who reached out without thinking it through carefully. He spent 2 weeks in back-and-forth correspondence before he agreed to a phone call, and his first question, when we got on the line, was whether we had ever dealt with a situation where the story involved land that had been in a family for a long time, and where making that story public might affect decisions the family still needed to make about the land. That is not a question we usually get asked. The man we will call Jeff agreed to talk on one condition. His real name would not be used, and nothing in how we described the property would allow anyone in the county to connect this story to his face. He was specific about that for reasons that become clearer the further you get into what he shared with us. His family has farmed this ground for over 100 years. His wife has worked in the local school district for the better part of 2 decades. Everyone in Price County knows everyone else's business, and a man who goes public with a story about a Dogman standing at his fence line in the middle of the night is a man whose credibility on everything else he might ever need to say is permanently altered by that conversation. He understood that, and he asked us to understand it too. The name is changed at his request. The location is real and specific enough for the geography to be verified, and no more specific than that. Jeff is in his early 50s. He has farmed the family property his entire adult life, running cattle for most of that time, transitioning to haying and some row crops in recent years as margins on beef tightened. He grew up on this land. His mother grew up on this land. His mother's father built the first permanent structure on it in the early 1920s, after coming over from Norway with a work history in the merchant marine and a determination to spend years pulling stumps before the place looked like anything a reasonable person would call a farm. 3 generations of the same family on the same 240 acres in the glaciated hill country of northwestern Wisconsin. Price County sits in the upper interior of the state, north of the Chippewa River watershed and south of the Gogabic Range. The county seat is Phillips, a working town of a few thousand people in a county that does not appear in travel guides or tourism campaigns. The character of the land is typical of the whole northern Great Lakes region. Drumlins and moraines from the last ice age, giving the ground a rolling, uneven quality. Kettle lakes pressed into the depressions, creek bottoms thick with cedar and tag alder, ridgelines of sugar maple, yellow birch, and balsam fir that can swallow a person completely within 100 yards of a road they have driven 1,000 times. The North Fork of the Flambeau River drains south through the western part of the county before joining the South Fork in Rusk County below. The Flambeau River State Forest covers portions of the county's central and eastern sections, roughly 85,000 acres of managed timber, lakes, and wetland that the Wisconsin DNR has administered since the 1930s, when the state bought back the stripped ground the lumber companies had finished with in the decade after the Civil War. The family property borders that state forest on its eastern edge. The woodlot on Jeff's land runs for about 1.5 miles along a ridge of glacial moraine before the ground drops into a small creek drainage that marks the informal boundary between his private timber and the state land. On the other side of that creek, the state forest extends for miles without a road or a structure, through terrain, where a person can walk for 2 hours without crossing a marked trail if they are not careful about their bearings.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Jeff's grandfather, a man the family knew only as Ezra, came to Price County in the early 1920s. He had served in the Norwegian Merchant Marine during the First World War and had crossed the Atlantic under circumstances he never discussed in detail with anyone he knew in Wisconsin. He arrived through a cousin who had settled near Phillips and was hauling timber for one of the smaller operations still working out what was left of the old-growth country in the northern counties. Ezra was not built for hauling timber. He had a gift for reading land, for understanding water drainage and soil composition, for sensing which slopes would carry crops and which would stay wet from May into September and grow nothing useful, for recognizing the difference between ground that could be made into productive farmland and ground that was going to resist being made into anything regardless of effort. He spent 3 years working for other men before he found the parcel he wanted. 240 acres of cut-over ground southeast of Ogama, bordered to the east by what would eventually become state forest land, with a decent creek running through the back half and a south-facing slope on the front end that looked like it might produce crops if a man was willing to put years into the preliminary work. The previous owners had taken the merchantable timber and moved on, as timber companies moved through northern Wisconsin in those decades, decisively and without looking back. What they left behind was a tangle of bare mineral soil and the occasional large-diameter red pine that had been judged not worth the freight cost. Ezra judged it worth the cost of putting in the work. He pulled stumps through the late 1920s. He built the farmhouse in 1928 using timber from his own woodlot and stone from the glacial moraine at the back of the property. He brought over a woman from Trondheim County in 1930, and they worked the ground together. And by the early part of the next decade, they had a barn, a milk cow, enough clear ground to grow, feed grain, and a kitchen garden, and the beginning of what would eventually become a working dairy operation. Dorothy was born in 1936. She was their only child to survive past infancy. Ezra worked the property until his mid-70s and died in the early 1980s, having spent his entire American life on those 240 acres and having told his daughter exactly one story about the land that he told no one else. He told it on a January night in 1979, when Dorothy was 43 years old and Ezra was in his mid-70s, and clearly aware that he had more past than future. He made it a considered occasion. He waited until they were alone in the farmhouse kitchen with the wind coming off the ridge and the temperature outside dropping through -15. He made coffee. He sat down across the table from her, and he told her about the 3rd day of February, 1951. In February of 1951, Ezra was 47 years old. He had been running a small trapline through the state forest to the east of the property for over 20 years by then, as most farm families in Price County did as a matter of practical income supplementation during the months when cold and snow reduced fieldwork to nothing. He was skilled at it. He understood the winter terrain in that section of the state forest, as well as he understood his own woodlot, intimately, from repetition, from reading the snow and the drainage and the animal behavior over the same routes through many winters. He knew which sections of the river bottom held mink consistently and which were hit or miss depending on the fall water levels. He knew the beaver impoundments and the runs between them. He knew the ridge that rose east of the creek and the draws on its eastern face where the fishers worked in winter. He worked on snowshoes, alone, in the morning hours when the light was good and the temperature was manageable. On the 3rd day of February, a front came in from the northwest, faster than the forecast out of Phillips had suggested. Ezra was 2 miles deep in the state forest, at the far end of his line where a loop took him past a beaver impoundment on the headwaters of a small creek tributary, and then back along the ridge toward the farm. He had walked this circuit in every kind of winter weather over the course of more than 2 decades. He had walked it in reduced visibility before, in heavy, overcast, and in lake-effect snow, and in the kind of light fog that sometimes settled into the drainages in January. He had not walked it in anything like what came in that afternoon. A full ground blizzard off the Gogabik Range moves differently from ordinary heavy snowfall. It does not just reduce visibility from above, it drives from the side, from the northwest, and when it hits the ridgelines of Price County, it comes through the timber in horizontal sheets that turn the individual trees into gray shapes at 30 yards and nothing at all at 50. The temperature drops as the front moves through. Wind chill in a Price County ground blizzard in February can reach 50 or 60 below. Ezra understood all of this the moment the wind shifted and he felt the temperature fall through his clothing. He had gone out equipped for a cold morning, not for an overnight emergency situation. He started east immediately, back toward the farm. He found his own snowshoe trail and followed it, which was the correct decision. The trail was holdable for the first 40 minutes, and he covered ground at a reasonable pace. And he told himself he was going to be fine. Then the wind shifted a second time and came around more from the north, and the last half-mile of his trail filled in as he watched it. The depressions in the snow softened and blurred, and became identical to the undisturbed surface around them. And within minutes he could not distinguish his own track from the general surface of the forest floor. He stopped. He tried to read the terrain for the landmarks he had used for 20-plus years on this route. In a ground blizzard severe enough to cut horizontal visibility to 30 or 40 feet in the timber, the landmarks you know become irrelevant because you cannot see them. The particular shape of the ridge and the angle of the drainage that he could normally read by the tilt of the ground under his feet were still there, but identifying which drainage he was in and which direction led to the farm required visual references he could not obtain. He walked east. He made his best judgment about east based on the wind direction, knowing the wind was out of the northwest and trying to keep it on his left shoulder and slightly behind him, which should have pointed him toward the farm. He walked for 30 minutes. The light was going, and the temperature was dropping, and he had been in the timber for over 4 hours by then. He told Dorothy that he began to feel the cold in the way that experienced people in the North Country know to be afraid of. Not as pain, but as a pleasant reduction of discomfort, as a warmth that was not warmth. He came to a fallen log and sat down on it, and the sitting felt better than the walking had felt, and he recognized that specific quality of better as the warning it was. He had enough experience in cold conditions to know that sitting down was the beginning of a sequence that ended badly. He said out loud, in Norwegian, "Get up and keep moving." He heard something move in the timber to his left. His first thought was bear. It was February, and the black bears in that part of the state were denned from late November through March under normal conditions, but a ground blizzard severe enough to drive cold through dens has been known to stir them into brief activity. He rejected bear within a few seconds, not from reasoning but from the quality of the sound. What he heard was not the blunt crash of a large animal moving through brush with no concern for what it disturbs. It was measured, rhythmic, aware of itself. The sound of an animal pacing alongside him rather than through him. He started walking again. The sound stayed in the timber to his left. At a consistent distance he estimated at 30 to 40 feet. Moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. He could not see it. The visibility in the timber was low enough that anything 30 feet away was invisible in the driving snow. He could hear it, a steady, heavy, purposeful sound of something large moving through snow on the north side of his path, paralleling him at a pace that matched his own without effort. For the better part of 2 hours, in Ezra's later estimate, this continued. He moved east. The sound moved with him. At one point, when the wind briefly slackened and the snow lightened for 30 or 40 seconds, the shape came to the edge of the timber at a natural clearing, about 50 feet from where Ezra had stopped. He looked at it. The light was going and the snow was still moving, but 50 feet in a brief lull gave him enough to register a shape before it disappeared again. What he saw was upright. That was the detail he repeated to Dorothy multiple times. That single specific quality. It was upright with nothing resembling a bear rearing on its hind legs, which is a rearing, an unstable posture held for a few seconds at most. This was standing, relaxed and upright, as something stands when upright is the natural position and not an effort. The head, visible for 2 or 3 seconds before the snow closed back in, had a profile that extended forward from the skull unlike anything an upright animal in northern Wisconsin produces. The ears were high. The shape was large enough that Ezra's estimation of its height, made in compromised conditions by a man who spent most of his working life estimating the height and weight of things in the field, was over 7 feet. Then the snow closed back in. The shape went back into the timber. The sound continued on his left. An hour later he saw the light from the barn. The shape had not appeared again after the clearing moment. He made it home. He changed into dry clothes and drank coffee, and went to bed without telling his wife what had happened in the timber, except that the weather had turned bad and he had taken longer than expected. He did not sleep well. In the morning the storm had passed, and the sky was clear and brutally cold. He went out before sunrise to check the snow around the barn and the woodlot, as he always did after a heavy storm. He found his own trail coming in from the east through the back woodlot and running alongside it, parallel, 10 to 15 feet to the north, and in the trees, the whole length of the woodlot, were tracks. He crouched down and examined them. 4 pad impressions with claw marks at the front, canid in structure, but larger than anything he had a reference for in 23 years of trapping and tracking in Price County. The largest gray wolf tracks he had ever measured in his trapline work were roughly 4 by 3.5 inches. These were larger. He measured the stride, over 4 feet between impressions in snow that was knee-deep and still settling, which meant the animal had been covering ground at a walk with a stride length that no wolf and no coyote in Wisconsin could produce. He walked the track line from where it emerged at the woodlot edge back toward the east, following it into the state forest for about 200 yards before the wind-smooth snow made further tracking impossible. The prince had paralleled his own trail from somewhere in the state forest north to the edge of his woodlot, at which point they turned north and went back into the timber. He went back to the farmhouse. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not speak for a long time. Then he went about the rest of his day's work. The years between the blizzard and Ezra's conversation with Dorothy in 1979 are the part of the record that Jeff finds most instructive when he is trying to understand what his grandfather had decided. Ezra did not stop trapping in the eastern sections of the state forest. He did not reduce his presence in that terrain. He continued working the same routes through the same country, pulling the same sets, doing the same work that had supplemented the farm's income through 2 decades of tight margins and difficult winters. He was, by any practical measure, unafraid. Not incautious, but not afraid. The distinction is one that Jeff returns to often, because it is the distinction that made the arrangement work across a century. What Ezra had done in the blizzard, in that long, cold walk east with the sound in the timber beside him, was the essential thing. He had kept moving. He had not stopped to investigate the sound. He had not called out, or thrown a branch toward it, or attempted to prove to himself, or to whatever was in the trees, that he was not concerned. He had kept his head, and his direction and his pace, and the sound had stayed in the trees and matched his pace, and eventually he had seen the light from the barn. The implicit contract of that interaction, as Ezra understood it after 28 years of working through what it meant, was that the terrain belonged to both of them, and could belong to both of them without incident, as long as neither party made a decision that forced the other to respond. He had not forced a response. He had simply walked home, and in the morning the tracks had been there in the snow, evidence of a parallel journey that had ended at the woodlot fence, and then turned north back into the forest. Whatever had tracked him through the blizzard had escorted him to the edge of the farm's ground, and then returned to its own. Ezra told Dorothy that in those subsequent years, especially in the first years after the blizzard, he had developed a set of habits in the field that he described to her as courtesy. He said the word in Norwegian and then in English, and seemed satisfied that both versions captured what he meant. He did not use the Eastern Creek drainage in the deep winter months. He did not set his traps on the ridgeline above the creek. He pulled his line back one section when he found what he believed was a denning area in the granite formation east of the drainage, and he moved those sets to a different section of the state forest that was lower and more open. He made these adjustments without resentment. He said to Dorothy that the territory had been there before he arrived, and that it would be there after he was gone, and that he had no more claim on the deep eastern sections than he had on the moon. He had the rest of the state forest, he said. He had 240 acres of his own ground. The arrangement, once he understood it, cost him almost nothing. What he had gained, he told Dorothy, was a quality of experience harder to name. He said, working a trapline in the state forest for 28 years with the knowledge that the territory was genuinely shared, that whatever was out there was aware of his presence differently from any animal in his entire previous experience of the North Atlantic and the northern woods had ever been aware of it, had changed the quality of his attention in that landscape, making him a better observer of everything he did find there. He looked at the terrain more carefully. He read the snow more carefully. He noticed the specific ways in which animal behavior in the broader forest was organized around a presence he could not see but could consistently infer. The territory was not just land with a secret in it. It was land that had its own logic, its own organization, its own layers, and the knowledge of the deepest layer had made the other layers more legible to him. He said he had spent the last 28 years feeling more present in that forest than he had ever felt in any other landscape he had worked in his life. Dorothy absorbed this. She wrote it down in the notebook she had opened for the occasion, Ezra's words in her own hand, because she understood by the time he told her that the knowledge was going to live or die based on how carefully she kept the record. She asked him why he had waited so long. He said he had been waiting until he was sure he understood it well enough to tell it correctly, and that the age he had reached had made it clear that if he waited any longer, he would risk not telling it at all. He did not tell anyone. He went back to the eastern section of the state forest the following week, when the snow had firmed up enough to hold detail, and he began to look at the timber he had been walking through for 23 years with a different kind of attention. He found the territorial markers on the red pines at the eastern edge of his woodlot within the first week of looking. Deep vertical gouges in the bark, running in groups of 4 from about 5 feet off the ground to just over 7 feet, on a line of trees that ran along the property's eastern fence. He had walked past these trees hundreds of times without understanding what they were. He had noted them as bare scratch marks, which is the obvious first interpretation, and had moved on without examining them carefully. Now he measured them, the spacing between individual claw marks, the width of each gouge, the height of the highest marks. None of it matched black bear claw evidence he had seen in the field. The highest marks were at 7 feet and change. A large Wisconsin black bear, standing at full height on its hind legs, reaches about 5.5 feet. A very exceptional specimen might push 6. 7 feet was a different animal. He found tracks at the creek crossing over the following weeks as the winter deepened and the snow held long enough to preserve impressions. He found what appeared to be a denning depression in the granite outcrop near the top of the ridge east of the creek, partially screened by fallen timber, showing signs of repeated use in the packed quality of the soil around its entrance. He made a note. He turned around and went back down the ridge, the same route he had come, and he did not go back to the outcrop again. Over the following years, he continued his trapline work in the state forest east of the property, running the same routes through the same terrain, checking the same sets he had been checking for decades, but he had recategorized what he was doing. He was no longer simply running a trapline. He was working in a territory that belonged to something else, and he was doing so with the awareness that whatever occupied that territory had made a decision about him, and that the decision was worth honoring. He did not change his routes or avoid the eastern sections. He did not stop working the timber. He simply stopped pretending he did not know what was there. He told Dorothy because he was in his mid-70s and he understood that the knowledge needed to go somewhere. He told her on a January night in 1979 with the wind off the ridge and the kitchen light on because he wanted to see her face when he said it, and because he believed she was the right person to have it. He told her what the tracks had looked like in the morning after the blizzard. He told her what the shape at the clearing had looked like. He told her about the territorial markers on the woodlot trees and what 28 years of subsequent observation had confirmed about the size and consistency of whatever was maintaining them. And then, he told her the thing he had worked out over those years to his own satisfaction. An animal that has lived alongside a person for that long and has not created harm is not interested in creating harm. He said it the way a man says something he has lived with long enough that he no longer needs anyone else to agree with it. And then he told her to pay attention to the east woodlot. Dorothy was a methodical woman. She got that from Ezra, who had been methodical about everything from the angle of his fence posts to the spacing of his trap sets. When he told her to pay attention to the east woodlot, she understood that he was not speaking loosely. She went looking within 2 weeks of that conversation, and what she found confirmed everything he had described. The territorial markers on the red pines along the woodlot's eastern boundary were exactly as Ezra had told her. Deep vertical gouges in groups of 4, running from about 5 feet off the ground to 7 feet and a few inches. She brought a measuring tape. The highest mark she could find was 7 feet and 3 inches. She was 5 feet and 7 inches tall. She had to stand on her toes and reach overhead to touch where the marks ended. The spacing between individual gouges was close to 3 inches from edge to edge, which she cross-referenced against the black bear scratch trees she knew from the wider property and the state forest. Bear scratch marks on the trees in this part of Wisconsin typically show individual claw impressions at 1.5 to 2 inches apart, matching the width of a black bear's front paw. 3 inches across was a hand nearly twice the span of any bear in the Price County record. She photographed the trees with the camera she had received as a Christmas gift. She wrote the measurements in a new notebook. She began walking the woodlot edge and the creek crossing after fresh snowfall, looking for tracks. The creek crossing she found most consistently was at a shallow ford about a 1/4 mile east of the woodlot's edge, where the water ran slow over a gravel bottom, and the banks on either side were composed of soft alluvial soil that held impressions well. She found tracks there in the deep winter of 1980, twice, and again twice in the winter of 1981. Each time she measured what she found. The stride lengths were between 48 and 53 inches. The individual prints measured between 5 and 5.5 inches long. She drew outlines in her notebook with her thumb positioned at the widest part of the track for scale. She compared these drawings to the wolf track records in the state DNR's predator monitoring publications she had obtained through the county extension office. The wolf records showed a maximum stride of about 30 inches at a walk, and individual tracks at a maximum of about 4.5 inches long for a large male. What Dorothy was measuring at the creek crossing was not a wolf. In the summer of 1974, before Ezra told her the blizzard story, she had her first direct sighting. She was 38 years old and walking the far eastern fence line one July evening, checking a section of wire that had pulled loose from a post after a windstorm the previous week. The light was going. She heard something large move in the balsam to the east, and she stopped walking. The sound had a quality she had never heard from any animal she could place in the Wisconsin woods. It was purposeful and slow, and the pace was consistent in the way that only a purposeful animal moves, not the random noise of a deer pushing through brush or the heavy crash of a bear in undergrowth. It stopped. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. The silence of an animal that has stopped moving and is listening. She turned toward the state forest. Something was standing at the balsam tree line 40 yards from where she was, upright. The silhouette cleared the brush at the woodlot edge by a considerable margin, enough to tell her that what she was seeing was taller than anything upright, had a right to be at the edge of a Wisconsin woodlot. The head was wrong. The muzzle projected forward from a skull that was built to different proportions from anything in the field guides she had been consulting since Ezra's trapline conversations began. The ears were pointed and high. She looked at it, and it looked at her. The specific quality of a mutual gaze between two animals that have arrived at the same point from different directions and are each deciding what the moment requires. Then it turned and went back into the balsam. Not in a hurry, not startled, simply done with the interaction and returning to whatever it had been doing. Dorothy walked backward to her truck and drove home without saying a word about it to anyone, which was characteristic of her. She spent 3 weeks deciding what to think about what she had seen. She added it to the notebook with the measurements, noting the height estimate against the known height of the brush at the fence line, the ear and muzzle configuration, the unhurried quality of the departure, the incident she considered the most significant, the one she told Jeff about with the most careful detail, happened in August of 1985, 2 years after Ezra died. She had a dog in those years, a shepherd mix she had gotten from a neighbor who could not keep the full litter. The dog was reliable in most situations and refused, over 3 consecutive nights that August, to go near the barn after dark, would not cross the yard, pressed herself against the farmhouse door with her hackles raised and stayed there. Dorothy had heard sounds in the barn on the second night, not a raccoon in the feed bins, but weight and movement more purposeful than any raccoon produced. She went out on the third night with a flashlight and the .22 rifle that had been Ezra's, which she was completely comfortable using. She heard it leave the barn as she crossed the yard, heard it clear the back fence in one motion and move into the east woodlot, heavy and fast and unhurried in the way that combined size with confidence rather than panic. She stood in the dark with the flashlight on the barn for a moment, then went in and checked everything. The horses were calm. The feed bins were closed and intact. The machinery was untouched. The dog had stopped barking. She checked the structure itself, the walls and the roof supports, and found nothing damaged. Whatever had been in the barn had been there without breaking anything. In the morning, she found tracks in the soft ground behind the barn. They went from the barn's back foundation to the woodlot fence, and then east toward the creek, a line of prints in the same size and stride range as everything else she had been documenting. She sat with this for a long time. There had been a severe thunderstorm 2 nights before. The first night, the dog refused the barn. Sustained wind and 2 lightning strikes in the county that started small fires that the local fire department had to suppress. Dorothy believed the animal had sheltered in the barn during that storm and had returned the following 2 nights by habit or by preference, and that it had left each time it heard a human approaching because the humans were less predictable in their behavior than the barn was. She told Jeff she found this clarifying rather than disturbing. The animal understood what a barn was for. What Dorothy's notebooks record is not just a collection of individual encounters. It is a portrait of an observer who understood that the significance of any single piece of evidence is proportional to the quality of the systematic record it is embedded in. She understood this not from any formal scientific training, because she had not had formal scientific training beyond what the Price County schools provided in the 1940s and 50s, but from the same practical intelligence that had made Ezra an exceptional reader of land. The understanding that a single track in the mud is an anecdote, and a decade of tracks measured in the same location under the same conditions is evidence. She organized her notebooks by year and by season within each year. She had a fall section for the months when the ground was soft enough after the first frosts to hold impressions, but before the snow came to cover them. She had a winter section for the snow tracking period, which in Price County ran reliably from November through March and intermittently through April. She had a spring section for the brief weeks when the creek bank mud held the clearest impressions of the year, before the vegetation grew back and obscured the access routes to the crossing. She had a summer section that was the thinnest of the 4, because summer conditions in the northern Wisconsin woods are generally the worst for track preservation, and because its movements in summer appeared to take it deeper into the state forest and farther from the farm boundary than in any other season. In each section she recorded date, time of observation, temperature, precipitation in the preceding 24 hours, specific location reference to landmarks she had named consistently across all the notebooks, the evidence observed, the measurements of that evidence, and her interpretation of what the evidence indicated. Her interpretations were careful and specific and free of the language of certainty. She wrote things like, suggests continued use of the creek crossing and consistent with the upper stride range of previous fall measurements, and the angle of the claw marks on the south-facing tree indicates an approach from the place north, which would be unusual and warrants further observation to confirm. She did not write proof of, and she did not write definitely. She wrote what the evidence indicated, and where it was ambiguous, she noted the ambiguity. She maintained a running comparison table at the back of each annual notebook, indexing each measurement against the full range from all previous years. The stride lengths ranged from 47 to 54 inches across 30 years of measurement, which indicated an animal that was not changing significantly in size over that period. A maturing animal would show increasing stride length in its early years and declining length in its oldest. A stable range across 30 years indicated an adult animal in the middle portion of its lifespan, which meant in turn that whatever she was documenting had been at the creek crossing in the same adult condition for the entire period she had been recording it. This was one of the pieces of the evidence that she found most significant and that she described to Jeff with the most care, because it meant the animal she was tracking in the winter of 2006, the last winter she was well enough to walk the woodlot fence, was the same animal Ezra had tracked in the winter of 1952. The same individual, healthy, active, maintaining the same territory across the better part of a century. She wrote in the last entry of the last notebook, made in October of 2005, that the question of what this indicated about the animal's lifespan was one she was not going to be able to resolve within her own observation period, and that she hoped Jeff would keep the comparison table current so that a future reader of the full record would have enough data to work with. She died in January of 2006 without adding another entry. Dorothy maintained the secret with remarkable discipline across the decades of her documentation. She lived in Price County her entire life. She attended church in Phillips. She knew everyone in the farming community within 20 miles of the property. She served on the local school board for 8 years in the 1980s, and the county fair committee for longer than that. She was not a reclusive person, and she was not without close friendships among the people she had grown up with. She managed the secret not by being solitary, but by being specifically careful. The subject of the eastern woodlot and the state forest behind it simply did not come up in conversation, the way any subject that does not come up in conversation does not come up. Nobody asked Dorothy Nygaard what lived in the timber east of the farm. If they had, she had a practiced and entirely honest answer prepared. Good black bear country back there, and a few wolves moving through in recent years. And she tried to leave it alone. The framework she passed to Jeff was not just practical rules about where to walk and when. It was an epistemological position. You do not go public with evidence you cannot defend in a public forum. The tracks are real and the measurements are accurate and the photography is genuine. And none of that matters in a forum that has decided in advance what animals live in Price County, Wisconsin, and what they look like, and what they weigh. The notebooks are for the family, she told Jeff. They are for the next person who needs to know what they are dealing with. They are not for the county board or the DNR or the newspaper in Phillips. They are for the family. It recognized the structure as shelter and made a decision to use it. It left when it heard a human coming, without damaging anything, which meant it understood the difference between the structure and its occupants, and that the occupants were not part of what the barn was for. That sequence of reasoning, if you could call it reasoning, told her more about what she was dealing with than months of track evidence had been able to tell her. Her framework, which she developed over 30 years and passed to Jeff in pieces as he grew old enough to understand each piece, was careful and consistent. The animal was not a threat, as long as the family was not a threat to it. It was not their guardian, and it was not their protector, and romanticizing it was a mistake that could lead to careless behavior on the family's part. It was an intelligent animal that had established a territory that happened to include the eastern edge of the farm, and it had been there far longer than the family had, and the practical arrangement for coexistence was simple. Stay out of the deep eastern sections of the state forest after dark. Do not place trail cameras or hunting stands on the ridgeline east of the creek. Do not work the beaver impoundment in December and January. Keep the dogs inside after 9 at night. Dorothy had maintained these habits without problem for the better part of 30 years. She expected Jeff to maintain them after her. Jeff was born in 1972. He grew up on the farm as children grow up on land their family has worked for generations. The place was not background, it was the whole context of his life. The back woodlot and the eastern ridge were as familiar to him as the kitchen, more familiar than any classroom. By the time he was 10, he could walk the woodlot alone in any season, without needing to tell anyone where he was going because everyone in the house knew where he would be, and in conditions that a city child would have found alarming, he found comfortable. Dorothy told him the first version of the story when he was 12. She was careful about it. She sat him down at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon in October and gave him the facts in the order they happened. Ezra's blizzard, the tracks in the morning, the 28 years of subsequent observation, her own sighting in the summer of 1974, the territorial markers on the woodlot trees, the measurements she had been collecting since 1979. She showed him the notebooks. She told him that whatever was out there was not a threat to the family as long as the family was not a threat to it. She told him the boundaries of appropriate behavior on the property's eastern section and why those boundaries existed. She told him she trusted him to maintain those boundaries and not to tell anyone outside the family, because the consequences of telling people were not ones she was willing to manage, and he would not be able to manage them either. Jeff was 12, and the information that an undocumented animal was living in the state forest behind the family's farm was electrifying in the way that genuinely dangerous information is electrifying to a 12-year-old. He wanted to see it. He spent the following months in the woodlot at dusk, sitting with his back against a tree and watching the eastern edge with the kind of patience that 12-year-olds can sometimes produce when the motivation is strong enough. He found tracks at the creek, crossing twice that winter and once in early spring, each time with stride measurements that matched the numbers from Dorothy's notebooks. He did not see anything that year, or the next. He saw it for the first time in the fall of 1985, when he was 13 years old. He was gathering firewood from a section of the back woodlot, where a wind event the previous spring had knocked down a line of red pines along the upper edge. Deadfall removal is work that does not require supervision. So Jeff was out there on a Saturday afternoon in late October with a bow saw and a pair of work gloves, cutting sections he could carry back in a wheelbarrow. The light was going. He had stayed past the reasonable stopping point, as 13-year-olds do when work has its own momentum. He heard something large in the balsam to the east. He stopped sawing and listened. The sound was heavy and slow, the kind of movement that carries weight without announcing itself, and it stopped after perhaps 15 seconds. The silence that followed had the quality of an attentive silence. He looked up. The balsam tree line was 40 yards east of where he was standing, and in the fading October light, a shape was standing at the edge of it. He could tell it was looking at him because the shape oriented as he turned his head, tracking him through the slow adjustment of its posture. It was upright, larger than any upright shape had a right to be at the edge of a Wisconsin woodlot. The head was wrong in the specific way Dorothy had described in the kitchen the previous year, the muzzle projecting forward from a skull built to proportions he had no reference for in 13 years of watching this landscape. The ears stood, pointed and high. The shoulders were wide enough to put the whole silhouette outside the range of anything in the field guide his mother kept on the kitchen shelf. He stood with the bow saw in his right hand and looked at it for what he estimated at 20 seconds. His body processed the situation before his mind did. Every muscle went still. His breathing changed. Something older than reasoning took over his response without asking permission. Then the shape moved back into the balsam, smooth, unhurried, and gone. Jeff picked up the firewood he had cut, as much as he could carry without the wheelbarrow, and walked back to the farmhouse. He did not run. He thought about running. He walked. He told Dorothy that night. She listened, asked 4 or 5 careful questions about the height relative to the brush at the tree line and the specific quality of the head shape, and then nodded. She said she had seen it twice herself from the eastern edge of the property, and that it had looked at her both times before going back into the timber. She said it was not looking for trouble. She said the boundaries she had described to him the previous year were the only thing she had ever needed to maintain, and she had done so without problems for more than a decade. Jeff carried the encounter into his adolescence the way you carry something that changes the proportion of things without changing the things themselves. The farm was the same. The woodlot was the same. The state forest to the east was the same, and in the eastern section of that forest, on the ridge above the creek crossing, something was living that he now understood differently. A transformation to his relationship to the land without any of the land itself being different. He had 2 more sightings before he was 20. One from the far field at dusk in the summer of 1987, a brief view of the shape moving south along the woodlot tree line at a distance of about 100 yards, and one close encounter in the summer of 1992, when he was 20 years old and had already been helping his mother run the farm operations for a couple of years. He had followed a creek drainage into the state forest farther than his mother's guidelines suggested was wise, drawn east by the sound of what he thought was a large group of deer moving through the bottom, and had come around a bend in the creek bank to find it standing in a shallow pool about 80 feet ahead of him. Upright, turned slightly sideways, in a stretch of water backed up behind a small beaver dam. He could see the coat in the summer light rather than just a silhouette. Dark brown, almost black, dense and thick through the chest and upper body. It turned its head toward him the moment he came around the bank, which told him it had heard him well before he saw it, and had already made whatever decision it was going to make about the situation. It held the look for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, it went down the bank on the far side of the creek, and into the alder on 2 legs, transitioning to 4, in a motion that he struggled to describe afterward, except to say it looked like watching water change direction, continuous, rather than sequential. He came back the next morning and measured the tracks at the creek bank. The depth of the impressions in the soft alluvial soil, compared to the depth his own foot made in the same substrate while bearing his full weight on one leg, put the animal at somewhere between 350 and 400 pounds. He wrote this down in the notebook he had started keeping independently of Dorothy's the year before. What he had assembled by the time he took over the farm from his mother in the mid-90s was a body of direct observation that complemented Dorothy's records with a precision of his own. He knew the territorial tree markers as well as any evidence in the family's documentation. He knew the creek crossing and the beaver impoundment and the granite outcrop on the ridge that he had identified from Dorothy's notes and confirmed on one visit in the late 90s before deciding, as his mother had, that the outcrop was ground he should respect by not approaching again. He had a clear picture of the territory and its extent, and he had the confidence in his own field skills to trust that picture. He married Karen in the late 90s. He told her the family's history with the Eastern Ridge before they married, in the specific detail that Dorothy had always believed the next generation deserved. Karen told him she would form her own opinion based on what she observed herself. She was a precise and careful person, and she did not commit to a position before she had evidence for it. Over the years that followed, she saw tracks at the creek crossing twice and heard, on one winter night in the mid-2000s, a low and structured vocalization from the direction of the eastern woodlot that she described to Jeff the next morning as a sound she had never heard before and could not attribute to anything in her experience of northern Wisconsin wildlife. She did not see the animal. Her position on the subject, maintained consistently since that winter night, was that she believed everything Jeff had told her and that she would continue to observe until the evidence warranted a stronger conclusion. Dorothy died in 2006 at 70 years old, having kept the notebooks for 30-plus years and having never told anyone outside the immediate family what they contained. Jeff locked the notebooks in a fireproof box in the office, along with his own records and the measurements from Ezra's notes that Dorothy had preserved. He continued the annual fall photographs of the territorial markers on the woodlot trees. He continued the track documentation at the creek crossing when conditions allowed, and he continued adding to the adult record that he had begun keeping in a separate notebook from Dorothy's when he was 16, a record that now covered 30 years of independent observation and gave the full family documentation a depth that no single generation account could have produced. The most significant thing that happened in Jeff's adult record before the mining permit was not a sighting and not a track event. It was an absence. In the fall of 2003, the territorial markers on the woodlot trees were not refreshed. Jeff had been photographing and measuring those marks every October since he was 16. In every previous year, fresh claw scoring appeared over the existing marks within a week or two of the first heavy frost, maintaining the line of gouged red pines along the eastern boundary fence, the way a property line is maintained, consistently, without interruption, by the passing of seasons or the changing of years. In the fall of 2003, Jeff walked the line in early October and found nothing new. He waited 2 weeks and walked it again. Nothing. He waited through November and walked it in the first week of December, when the old marks were clearly distinguishable by color and condition from any new scoring. Still, nothing new, he told Dorothy. She said she had noticed something similar in the fall of 1992, when there had been a gap of about 6 weeks before the marks appeared, and that in her interpretation, This reflected the animal having been further east in the state forest for longer than usual during the fall hunting pressure period, when the adjacent land was carrying more human foot traffic than at any other point in the year. She said she would watch and see. By January of 2004, the marks had been refreshed, and the gap in the record was noted in Jeff's notebook and set aside. He mentions the 2003 gap now because the gap in 2024 was longer and produced no refresh. 8 weeks from the first frost without a single new mark on the woodlot trees. Jeff walked the line in early December and found nothing. He found tracks at the creek crossing in late November, a single clear impression in the frost-softened bank mud at the ford. One left rear print at the lower end of the normal stride measurement range, clearly recent. The animal was still in the territory, but the territorial marking behavior had stopped. He noted this in the log he had been keeping alongside his track documentation since his mid-30s, when he began to understand that behavioral change over time was as significant a data point as any individual piece of physical evidence. He noted it and moved on, and did not fully connect the timing to the mining permit application until after the first vocalization from the East Woodlot reached him through the kitchen window at 2 in the morning in October. Jeff's 30s had also brought 2 sightings that the family record does not have a category for. Encounters that were neither the brief visual contact of the earlier years, nor the dramatic proximity of the beaver pond. They were something quieter and more difficult to describe, and he records them in his notebooks without the confident physical description language of the encounters before them. The first was in August of 2001, the summer Luke was born. Jeff was in the back woodlot at dusk, working a section of fence that had been hit by a windstorm the previous week. He heard something moving in the balsam to the east, stopped working, and looked up. He saw nothing in the timber. He heard the movement stop. He stood still and listened, and heard nothing further. After several minutes, he went back to the fence repair. When he was done and walking back to the farmhouse, he heard the movement again, in the timber to his left and slightly behind him, at the same pace as his own walk. He did not stop this time. He kept walking, matching his pace, not hurrying. The sound in the timber matched him for the length of the woodlot, and then stopped at the woodlot fence. He heard nothing after that. He does not claim this is significant at the level of the beaver pond. He notes it because the quality of the contact, something moving parallel to him in the timber and stopping at the woodlot boundary, the way it would have stopped if it understood the boundary, is consistent with what Ezra described in the blizzard and what the track evidence from the night after the blizzard had confirmed. He does not know if it was directing him back toward the house or simply moving through its territory on a route that happened to parallel his. Both explanations are plausible. He wrote it down because his mother had taught him to write it down. The second encounter was more recent, in September of 2019, and it did not involve the animal at all, but rather its response to an event on the property. Jeff had been having a problem with coyotes working the back pasture that summer, taking more than the usual number of lambs from a small flock he had been running, and in late August, he had called a USDA Wildlife Services trapper, who came out, assessed the situation, and recommended a series of coyote trap placements along the eastern fence line and into the south corner of the back woodlot. Jeff agreed, and the sets went in. 3 weeks later, with the traps still active, the territorial marks on the eastern fence line trees were refreshed twice in the same month, both sets of marks more recent than any previous spacing in the fall record. Dorothy's notebooks showed no previous instance of the territorial marking being refreshed more than once in a 4-week period at any point in 30 years of observation. Jeff pulled the traps from the woodlot section at the end of that week. The double refresh did not recur. He noted in his log that the trapping activity in the woodlot had appeared to produce a territorial response, and that the response had stopped when the trapping stopped. An animal that responds to a change in human activity on the adjacent property with a change in its own territorial marking frequency is an animal that is paying attention to what happens on that property. This is the thread that runs through every piece of the family's accumulated record, from Ezra's blizzard forward. Attention. Whatever is in the state forest east of the creek crossing has been paying sustained attention to the farm and to the family that works it for longer than the family has been keeping records of what it noticed. He continued the track documentation at the creek crossing when conditions allowed. He continued the territorial boundary habits his mother had maintained. The eastern section of the state forest left alone after dark. The beaver impoundment given space in the winter months. The dogs inside after 9. The habits had cost him essentially nothing over 30 years of farming. He had simply built them into his routine, the way you build anything into a routine, when the reason is consistent and the cost is low. The incident from December of 1989 is the one that stays with Jeff most persistently of all the encounters the family has documented across 3 generations. He has replayed it in his mind more times than he can count. It is the clearest example in the entire record of its behavior, intersecting with a human situation and producing a specific, observable outcome. And it is the one piece of the family's history that the broader Dogman research literature, if it ever became available to researchers, would find most significant. He was 17 years old. He had a hunting partner, a friend from the county he had grown up with, a boy from Ogama whose name we are not using for the same reason we are not using Jeff's. The 2 of them were working a deer ridge in the state forest east of the farm on a cold Saturday in early December. The previous year had been a good deer year on that ridge, and they had scouted it in October and identified 2 productive stand locations, one on a red pine midway up the eastern slope and one lower, where a game trail crossed between 2 areas of heavy browse near the beaver impoundment. Jeff took the upper stand. His partner took the lower one, about 200 yards north and 100 feet below. Jeff's partner left his stand during the midday lull, which happens to every hunter and is generally harmless. He walked the southern edge of the beaver impoundment, looking for fresh deer sign in the soft ground near the inlet creek. The inlet is where the ice is thinnest on a pond like that one, where moving water prevents the freeze from solidifying at the same depth as the main body. This is the kind of thing you know if you have grown up working this country in winter. Jeff's partner knew it. He came too close anyway, which is also the kind of thing that happens, because the fresh tracks you are following end at the water's edge, and you take one more step to see where they went. He went through the ice, both legs into water that was less than 3 feet deep but cold enough to be dangerous within 3 or 4 minutes of exposure, and the ice edge that should have given him something to pull against cracked and widened with every attempt. He had his arms over the surface, but he could not get the leverage to get his hips onto the ice. He had been in the water about 2 minutes when he started calling for Jeff. Jeff heard him. He was on his feet and moving north toward the pond in seconds, covering the 200 yards from his stand at a full run through the timber, dodging the understory, trying to locate the direction of the voice. As he ran, he heard something moving in the timber north of the pond, moving fast and not trying to be quiet about it. The heavy, crashing kind of movement that large animals produce when they are closing ground at speed. He registered this and kept running, because his partner's voice was getting more urgent and the direction was clear. He reached the south edge of the pond and saw his partner in the water near the west end, 30 yards away, both arms over the ice and unable to get out. And on the north bank of the pond, at the tree line on the far side of the water, a shape had emerged from the timber and stopped, upright, in the December light, about 100 feet from where Jeff's partner was struggling. The size, the head shape, the posture. Jeff knew what he was looking at. He had known since he was 13, but this was different from any previous sighting, because it had not walked to the tree line and regarded the scene and turned away. It had come at speed. It was standing at the north bank, with its head oriented toward the man in the water, and it was still. Then, it made a sound. Jeff has tried to describe this sound to us on 2 separate calls, because we asked him to repeat the description. It was low, lower than the lower register of anything he could name from his experience in the North Country. A pulse, rather than a sustained note, a single event with a specific structure that started below the threshold of comfortable hearing and rose through frequencies his chest registered before his ears did. He said the sound had a directional quality, aimed south across the pond rather than at the sky or the timber, aimed at the man in the water. He said it lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and he said his partner's reaction was immediate and extreme, and 30 years of subsequent thinking has not allowed him to fully categorize. The boy in the water made a sound of his own, a pure, involuntary cry of overwhelming terror, and the adrenaline that came with it gave him what 2 minutes of sustained effort had not produced. He got his arms down flat on the ice surface, shifted his weight forward, and hauled himself out of the water and onto the ice in one convulsive motion, scrambling backward on his hands and knees across the ice surface, away from the north bank, away from the shape at the tree line, toward the south edge, where Jeff was standing. He did not look back at the north bank. He did not have to. He was moving. By the time Jeff reached the ice edge, his partner was on the surface and moving toward him. Jeff looked across the pond to the north bank. It was empty. The timber was still. He helped his partner off the ice and walked him back to the farm, moving as fast as Jeff could manage, with a boy who was deeply hypothermic and shaking badly enough that he could not maintain his footing on the uneven terrain without support. 2 hours of careful rewarming in the farmhouse before his color returned. 2 hours during which Jeff's partner said nothing about what he had seen on the north bank. Jeff did not raise it. Dorothy, who had been in the farmhouse when they came in, understood immediately what had happened, from the track of ice water through her kitchen and from the look on her son's face. And she said nothing either. She made coffee and kept the fire up and did not ask questions. Jeff's partner called 2 days later. He said he was not going back to that ridge. He said the thing he had seen on the north bank was not a bear, and he did not know what it was, and he did not want to know. He moved to Wausau the following spring, for reasons Jeff believed were at least partly genuine, and Jeff had not spoken to him since the mid-90s. The element that Jeff returns to most consistently when he thinks about that afternoon is not the shape on the north bank. It is the timing and the trajectory. It had been moving north of the pond at speed before Jeff reached the south edge. It had covered a significant distance through timber at a run before stopping at the north bank. It had arrived at the pond before Jeff was close enough to be useful from his direction, which meant it had been moving toward the situation before Jeff was near enough to contribute to the outcome. Whether it had heard the crack of the ice going through, or whether it had been close enough to the pond already for some other reason, it had been closing ground before Jeff was in a position to help. He does not claim it intended to save his partner's life. He is honest about that and careful about it, because the honesty matters to him, and because Dorothy's warning about romanticizing the animal has stayed with him for 30 years. He says it is possible it had arrived at the pond for reasons entirely unrelated to the situation in the water, and produced the sound for reasons unrelated to the effect it had. He says that is possible. He also says that a man who has been reading animal behavior in the field since childhood, and who was standing on the south bank of a beaver pond in December of 1989, watching a hypothermic 17-year-old to haul himself out of the ice, does not find the word coincidence entirely satisfying when he applies it to what he saw. What the Dogman's arrival at the north bank of that impoundment demonstrates, at minimum, is awareness. It was aware that something was happening at the pond. It arrived with enough speed and from the right direction to have been responding to the situation rather than simply passing through the area. And the sound it produced at the specific moment when the person in the water needed something to override his body's freeze response produced the exact response that a person in that situation needed to survive. Whether that sequence reflects intention or accident or something in between that the available vocabulary does not adequately cover, Jeff has thought about it for 35 years without arriving at a clean answer. The broader historical record for Dogman encounters in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region gives context to what the family documented on that property across 3 generations, with a specificity no single incident report can provide. Linda Godfrey spent 30 years collecting accounts of large upright canine creatures from across the state, eventually from across the country. Her work began in 1991, when she was a reporter for the Walworth County Week in southeastern Wisconsin, and began receiving calls about something people were seeing on Bray Road, a rural stretch in Walworth County near the town of Elkhorn. Her first article ran on December 29th of that year, under a headline that treated the subject with enough journalistic seriousness that the response came in waves rather than trickles. Within weeks, she had more accounts than she could process. What emerged from the accumulated reports was a profile consistent enough across hundreds of independent witnesses that the word coincidence does not adequately explain it. Large upright canine, typically between 6 and 8 feet tall when standing, capable of moving on either 2 or 4 legs, transitioning between the two with a fluidity that witnesses consistently described as unlike any animal they could name. Associated with waterways, rivers, beaver ponds, creek bottoms, lake margins, predominantly nocturnal but not exclusively, dark in coloring, typically brown to black, canine head with elongated muzzle and pointed ears held erect, arms that hung longer than human proportions when standing upright, and, across hundreds of accounts, a consistent behavioral profile of territorial intelligence rather than predatory aggression, warning behavior rather than attack, restraint when attack was clearly possible, strategic avoidance of sustained human contact, and a documented awareness of human technology that extended in some accounts to the active avoidance or manipulation of recording equipment. Godfrey's fieldwork extended through Wisconsin's northern counties, and she documented accounts from the general Flambeau River drainage that she treated with the same careful attention she gave to the Bray Road accounts that had brought her into this work in the first place. The witnesses in those northern accounts, like Jeff, declined to allow identifying information into any public record. What Godfrey documented across them was behavioral consistency, the territorial patterns, the nocturnal movement, the association with the specific terrain features of the northern river drainage, and the repeated observation that the creatures understood human activity patterns well enough to adjust their own behavior in response to changes in human presence. The Steve Cook origin story is worth understanding as cultural context for why the Wisconsin Dogman has the documentation record it has. In 1987, Cook was a disc jockey at WTCM in Traverse City, Michigan. He wrote a song called The Legend as an April Fool's Day broadcast piece, constructing from nothing a being he called the Michigan Dogman, which he said appeared on a 10-year cycle in the forests of the northern Lower Peninsula. He performed it on the air and admitted it was invented. What followed was not what any reasonable person would have predicted. Listeners who had heard the song began contacting the station to describe their own encounters that predated the song by decades, and that matched what Cook had invented with a specificity that Cook himself found genuinely disturbing. He had not created a mythology. He had accidentally created a permission structure for reporting an experience that hundreds of people had been carrying in silence because they had no word for it and no reason to expect anyone to believe them. Cook eventually added additional verses to the song based on accounts that came to him. Wisconsin contributed heavily to those accounts. The consistent behavioral and physical description across independent witnesses who had never communicated with each other and who were located across hundreds of miles of the Great Lakes region established a pattern that was difficult to apprise, explained through the mechanisms that usually account for shared folklore, media contagion, cultural transmission, collective misidentification. The witnesses were describing the same animal before they had any common media exposure to what the animal was supposed to look like. Many of them had seen it years or decades before Cook's song gave it a name. The oldest documented account in the regional record comes from 1887 in Wexford County, Michigan, near the Manistee River. 2 lumberjacks working the timber camps at the peak of the northern Michigan lumber era described an encounter with a being that had a man's body and a dog's head. The account was committed to writing and circulated in the logging community at the time, which was unusual for the culture. Logging camp accounts of unusual wildlife encounters were typically oral, passing from crew to crew without anyone feeling compelled to write them down. The specificity and the seriousness with which this one was documented suggests the encounter made an impression that the men who experienced it could not reduce to the ordinary category of a wildlife sighting. Linda Godfrey, in her documentation of the Michigan case record, placed the 1887 account as the oldest verifiable modern report from the Great Lakes region. Price County sits in the middle of the territory that has been producing consistent accounts since that earliest documentation. The Flambeau River system runs through a corridor that connects, geographically and ecologically, to the same northern forest systems where the oldest accounts originate. The terrain is the same general character as the Manistee River country in Michigan: glaciated lake country, river bottoms, upland timber, the same mix of hardwood and conifer, the same density of wetlands and beaver work. The prey base is the same: white-tailed deer, beaver, muskrat, the same fish and waterfowl communities in the same lake and river habitats. If whatever has been documented across 100 years of the Great Lakes region's reportable history is real and uses the northern forest ecosystem as its habitat, Price County is exactly where you would expect to find it. The Anishinaabe peoples of the western Great Lakes have known this country for thousands of years, and their oral traditions contain accounts of beings that occupy a category distinct from ordinary wildlife. The Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, holds a reservation in Vilas County, directly east of Price County, and their traditional territory encompassed the Flambeau River drainage and the Price County interior for centuries before European contact. The name Lac du Flambeau itself reflects the French traders' observation of a practice that had been in place for generations: the Ojibwe method of spearing fish by torchlight in the shallow lake water at night. The Ojibwe name for the place was Waswaganing, meaning the place where they spear fish by the light of torches. The Anishinaabe oral tradition makes systematic distinctions between the beings that belong to the natural world as ordinarily experienced, and the beings that occupy the boundary territory between the natural world and what lies beyond it. These intermediary beings do not belong to the category the Western conceptual framework labels as above or outside nature. In the Anishinaabe worldview, they are part of the natural order, but they move through that order according to different rules than ordinary animals follow. They occupy specific territories and maintain those territories across time. They respond to the presence of humans who enter their territories in ways that ordinary animals do not. They demonstrate awareness of human behavior and adjustment to changes in that behavior that goes beyond what predator-prey dynamics or territorial competition accounts for. When Linda Godfrey conducted her fieldwork in northern Wisconsin and reached out to indigenous communities with knowledge of the region's oral traditions, the responses she received were not skeptical, they were careful. Indigenous community members who were willing to speak with her at all responded with a specific quality of recognition. They knew the category of being she was describing. They had their own names for it, names they were generally unwilling to share with an outsider, and they understood that specific territories in the northern Wisconsin forest had been associated with these beings in the oral tradition for far longer than European contact had been bringing written records to the region. When Godfrey asked whether the beings were dangerous, the consistent answer she received was that they were dangerous if you did not treat the territory appropriately, and not dangerous if you understood how to move through the land correctly. Ezra, who arrived in Price County in the early 1920s, with no knowledge of this tradition and no access to any framework that would have given him a word for what he encountered in the blizzard of 1951, arrived at essentially the same practical conclusion through 28 years of independent observation. His advice to Dorothy was not meaningfully different from what the elders of the Lac du Flambeau Band were telling Godfrey generations later. Respect the territory, and you will not have problems. The Anishinaabe tradition had arrived at this framework through thousands of years of living alongside whatever occupies those territories. Ezra arrived at it through one terrifying afternoon in a ground blizzard and the decades of careful attention that followed. The convergence of the two frameworks, independent of each other and across a vast difference in cultural context and timescale, is one of the things that Jeff finds most compelling about the family's situation. The knowledge his grandfather developed alone, through observation, matches the accumulated traditional knowledge of a people who had been living in that same drainage for millennia. That alignment does not prove what the family has been living alongside, but it does suggest that whatever it is, it has been there long enough for more than one culture to develop a working relationship with it. If you have spent time anywhere in the Flambeau River country in Price or Rusk County, or in the mixed timber and farm ground north of Ladysmith, let me know in the comments. The reports I have been looking into from this drainage and from the country between the North Fork and the county line go back considerably further than the Nygaard family's arrival in the area, and I want to hear from anyone who has had an experience out there that matches what we are covering here. The mineral exploration permit that Northland Meridian Resources filed in October is public record, available through the Wisconsin DNR's online permit tracking system, and the geological basis for the application is real and verifiable. The Flambeau Mine in Ladysmith, in Rusk County, roughly 30 miles south of the family property, extracted copper, gold, silver, and zinc from a Precambrian volcanogenic massive sulfide deposit. Between 1993 and 1997, it was one of the highest-grade copper mines ever operated in the upper Midwest, and one of the most environmentally contested, both during its operation and in the years after its closure, when acid mine drainage from the site contaminated sections of the Flambeau River and required state-mandated remediation that continued for years beyond the mine's operational period. The geology that produced the Flambeau mine deposit extends north from Rusk County into Price County in patterns that exploration geologists have been aware of since at least the 1970s. A junior mining company targeting that formation in the state forest sections of eastern Price County is not making a geologically unreasonable decision. The copper is there, in amounts that justify the cost of exploration, drilling, or the permit application would not have been funded. What the permit application proposes, in practical terms, is a sequence of activities that would transform a section of the state forest east of the family property over a period of months. The first phase is a geophysical survey using ground-penetrating methods, which requires crews on foot carrying equipment through the timber. The second phase is access road construction to the 3 proposed drill sites, using equipment that would need to be moved over new roads cut through state forest land. The third phase is core drilling at each site, which requires a truck-mounted drill rig, a generator, fuel storage, and a crew present throughout the operating day. The timeline in the permit application, if approved and if the company proceeds on schedule, runs from the following spring through at least the following fall, with the possibility of extension depending on what the cores produce. Jeff spent a week with the permit maps after he first pulled the application, cross-referencing the proposed drill site locations against his own track concentration maps and the territorial marker data he had accumulated over 30 years. The relationship between the proposed Site C location and the center of its territory was not ambiguous to him. The heaviest track evidence, the most heavily and most consistently refreshed territorial markers, the granite outcrop depression he had identified in the late 90s and not approached again since, all of it concentrated on the ridgeline that Site C would place a drill pad on. The access road that would need to be built to reach Site C would follow the drainage bottom north from the county road before climbing the ridge, a route that passed within 100 yards of the beaver impoundment through the terrain that had produced the heaviest track evidence in 30 years of observation. 3 weeks after he pulled the permits, and about 2 weeks after what he believed were survey crew vehicles in the section of the county road that accessed the forest, the behavior on the property changed. He is careful to note that he cannot prove the timing is causal. He is noting it because it is what the evidence shows, and 30 years of observing this animal has not left him with any reason to distrust the pattern recognition he has developed for its behavior. The first sign of the change was the vocalization. He heard it from inside the farmhouse at 2 in the morning on a Saturday in the 3rd week of October, coming from the direction of the eastern woodlot, the same structure he had heard 3 times before in 30 years. A low, organized sound with a directional quality that his body registered before his ears did. But from within the property boundary, not from across the creek in the state forest, from the woodlot itself, from ground that belonged to the farm. He sat in the kitchen with Karen and listened for 30 minutes. The sound did not repeat. In the morning, he walked the woodlot edge and the creek crossing and found tracks, fresh, less than 12 hours old, based on the condition of the frost crust over the impressions in the creek bank mud. The prints were consistent with 30 years of documentation, but the track line was different from anything he had recorded before. It had not crossed the creek and turned back as it usually did. It had come along the creek bank west, following the fence line that separated the woodlot from the back field, all the way to the field corner. Jeff followed the track around the corner and found it continued north along the next fence side, and then west again along the 3rd side of the field. It had walked the perimeter of the backfield fence, the whole thing, following the fence that bordered the interior of the farm rather than the eastern boundary with the state forest. It had come inside the margin it had maintained for 100 years. 4 nights after he found those tracks, the game camera on the south fence post captured the footage. The game camera Jeff had mounted on the south woodlot fence post 2 years earlier was there for deer surveillance, positioned to cover the backfield from the woodlot edge. He checked it weekly, and had recorded nothing in the previous several months beyond the expected deer traffic and a coyote pair that had been working the field margins since late summer. He downloaded the card on the morning after the recording as part of his usual weekly check, without any particular expectation of what he would find. We want to be precise about how we are describing this footage and honest about the limits of what we can show. The clip, visible at the opening of this video, represents a portion of what was captured. The full recording was reviewed by us in private, described to us in detail by Jeff across 2 separate conversations, and what we describe here is what the camera documented as Jeff understood it, and as the portions we reviewed confirmed. We are not working from speculation or from Jeff's interpretation alone. The recording begins with an empty backfield. The fence runs along the bottom of the frame, the woodlot visible beyond it. The field extends south into the darkness outside the camera's infrared coverage, which on a camera of this type and in this placement reaches roughly 80 to 90 yards under good conditions. At the far limit of the camera's range, a shape enters the frame from the south. It is walking upright. The gait is unhurried and smooth, covering ground at a pace that suggests efficiency rather than caution, and there is no lateral compensation in the stride, no rolling or rocking, no evidence of a body working against a posture that does not come naturally to it. It walks upright the way something walks when upright is what it was built for. As the shape crosses the field north toward the camera, its scale becomes apparent against the known reference points. The fence posts along the bottom of the frame are 5 feet and 4 inches from cap to ground, a measurement Jeff knows because he installed them. The shape's head clears the top of the nearest post by a significant and unambiguous margin. Jeff estimated the height at between 7 feet and 8 inches based on the comparison, accounting for the camera angle and the distance from the post. The coat is dense and appears dark in the infrared rendering, covering the torso and the upper arms, and visible along the outside of the thighs. As the shape walks, the head shape is legible at this distance in resolution. The muzzle projects forward from the skull. The ears stand erect and pointed. The eyes, when they catch the camera's infrared emitter on the shape's approach to the fence, return 2 points of amber-white light at an interpupillary distance, wider than any animal in the Wisconsin Field Guide, set in a head built to a different specification. The shape reaches the fence post. It stops. It stands. The head turns toward the farmhouse, visible 60 yards north across the yard, dark because Jeff and Karen are asleep. The shape stands at the post, with its face oriented toward the house for 4 minutes and 23 seconds, which is how long Jeff measured the still portion of the recording before the shape turned and walked back across the field at the same unhurried pace and disappeared from the camera's range. 4 minutes and 23 seconds is a long time to stand still at a fence post in the middle of the night. Jeff has stood at that fence post himself hundreds of times over 30 years of farming, and he has stood there for that duration maybe twice. Once, when he was trying to spot a deer he had heard in the woodlot, and once when he was watching a thunderstorm build on the eastern horizon. The shape stood at the post with its face toward the house and did not move its feet for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. It did not investigate the wire. It did not examine the post. It faced the house. Jeff reviewed the footage in the morning before Karen came down for breakfast. He watched it through twice. He went to the kitchen and made coffee. He called Karen in and she watched it twice without speaking. He asked her what she thought. She said they needed to figure out what they were going to do. Then she poured her coffee and went to get dressed, because she was a person who processed difficult information by moving through the practical requirements of the day rather than by sitting with it. Jeff walked to the fence post before the morning's work began. He examined the south face carefully. He found marks that had not been there 3 weeks earlier, when he had last done a close inspection of the fence. 2 parallel horizontal scratches, shallow but distinct, at a height of 4 feet and 11 inches off the ground. He measured this 3 times. 4 feet and 11 inches. He is 5 feet and 10 inches tall. The marks were at a height slightly below his eye level, well within the range where a person standing at the fence post would look without searching. The marks were not at the top of the post, where an animal reaching up would naturally place them. They were not at the heights of the territorial gouges on the woodlot trees, which ran from 5 to 7 feet. The spacing between the 2 parallel scratches was about 2.5 inches. consistent with 2 fingers rather than a full hand, and the individual lines were shallow, pressed into the weathered cedar, without the force that the territorial marks on the trees required. They were not territorial marks in the sense that anything in the family's documentation had defined territorial marks. They were different in size, in height, in the number of lines, and in the amount of force applied. They were intentional in the way that marks made with specific intent rather than habitual purpose are intentional, made at a height that a person walking up to that fence post would look at without searching. Jeff has looked at them in his photographs. He has looked at them in the notebooks. He has looked at every piece of territorial behavior in 30 years of family documentation, and he cannot find a precedent. He reached out to this channel in November because he did not know where else to take what he had found. Luke came home the first weekend in November. He is 23 years old, works in civil engineering in Green Bay, and grew up with the family's history with the Eastern Ridge, the way Jeff had grown up with Ezra's Blizzard account, as a framework for understanding the land, rather than as something requiring immediate resolution. He was skeptical in the way that people with technical education sometimes are about things that do not have a documented mechanism, not dismissive, but not committed. He had never seen anything in the woodlot that he could not explain, and he filed the family's accumulated experience under things to be determined later, and went back to his work. Jeff did not tell him about the footage or the permit application before the visit. He had not decided how to frame the conversation, and he did not want to frame it badly. On Saturday morning, he showed Luke the game camera recording on his phone. Luke watched it twice. He asked whether the camera could have malfunctioned. Jeff told him the camera was functioning correctly, that the footage before and after its appearance was normal, and that the date stamp was accurate because he checked the camera's settings against his phone time every week. Luke accepted this and said nothing else useful. He spent the rest of Saturday being quiet with a quality Jeff had not seen from him before. On Sunday morning, before breakfast, Luke told Jeff he had set up his own game camera on the south fence line the previous afternoon, after Jeff had shown him the footage, facing north toward the woodlot rather than south toward the field. He had done it without telling Jeff, because he wanted results that were not influenced by Jeff's interpretation. He had retrieved the camera before coming downstairs and downloaded the card on his laptop. He showed Jeff the screen. The camera had captured something between 1:40 and 2 in the morning. Not at the fence line this time. In the field itself. About 40 yards south of the woodlot fence, between the fence and the house, closer to the house than the Dogman had been on the night Jeff's camera had recorded it. The image was lower quality than Jeff's camera, a consumer-grade infrared unit Luke had bought at a sporting goods store for deer surveillance purposes, and in the lower resolution, the image was less specific than Jeff's footage. But what was visible was not ambiguous as to category. A heat signature consistent with a large, upright animal, standing taller and broader through the shoulders than any animal Luke could place in a Wisconsin field guide, moving slowly at a walk across the field from east to west, not toward Luke's camera, appearing unaware of the camera's position. In 2 of the frames before the signature moved out of the frame, the profile showed the projection of a muzzle distinct from the rounded skull profile of a bear, extending forward from a head that was built to proportions Luke had no reference for in his 23 years of familiarity with northern Wisconsin wildlife. It had been in the field, between the fence and the house. Luke downloaded the footage to a flash drive and left it on the kitchen table. He packed his bag and loaded his truck. He drove to the end of the farm road, stopped, and came back. He got out of the truck. He said 2 things. He said Jeff should get the woodlot assessed for a conservation easement and contact an accredited land trust about a permanent protection designation on the eastern section of the property. Then he said he was not going to be coming back to the farm for a while. He needed time to process what he had seen. He got back in the truck and drove to Green Bay. He has not called since. That was 3 weeks before Jeff's first email to this channel. The absence of that call is something Jeff has thought about more than he expected to. He has spent 30 years carrying this knowledge with very few people to share it with. Dorothy had known, and Dorothy's death in 2006 had left Jeff and Karen as the only people who understood what the Eastern Ridge actually contained. Luke had grown up in the house, with the framework, with the stories, with the notebooks in the fireproof box. and Jeff had always assumed that when the moment came for Luke to have the full picture, he would absorb it the way his mother and his grandfather had absorbed difficult information before him, with the kind of careful pragmatism that comes from a family that has always made its living by understanding the land correctly. What he had not fully accounted for was that knowing something in theory and watching it move across your parents' backfield at 2 in the morning are different experiences with different consequences. Luke had spent the weekend not disagreeing with the family's history. He had spent the weekend sitting with footage of a large Dogman in his parents' field, and then driven back to his apartment in Green Bay without saying what he was going to do with that. Karen's response to the situation is characteristic of how she has always handled the difficult aspects of living with what the family knows. She is practical and clear-eyed, and she does not let the difficulty of a problem prevent her from identifying the available options. She told Jeff the week after the footage that they needed to make a decision about the permit comment period before it closed. The Wisconsin DNR's review process for mineral exploration applications on state land requires a public comment period during which any member of the public can submit written objections to the department. The comment period does not require objectors to disclose their motivation or to provide evidence for their concern beyond what is publicly available and relevant to the categories the DNR is required to consider. A comment citing habitat concerns for state-listed species documented in the Price County section of the state forest is a legitimate and accepted form of objection that the department must acknowledge and address in its review. Jeff does not have to mention a Dogman. He does not have to mention the fence post marks. He does not have to produce 30 years of track documentation or the photographs of the territorial markers on the woodlot trees. He can file a comment tomorrow about the gray wolf corridor, about the American marten habitat, about the watershed sensitivity of the creek drainage, and the DNR will be required to respond to it. He has not filed the comment. He has not explained to Karen exactly why, and she has not pressed him on it, because they have been married long enough that she knows the difference between a decision he has not made yet and a decision he has made and is not ready to say out loud. The answer, as Jeff has worked it out in the weeks since the footage, is layered enough that any single explanation is inadequate. Part of it is the concern about what filing the comment might set in motion. A public objection to the permit is a public record, and public records attract attention from people who might decide they want to know more about why a landowner adjacent to this specific section of state forest is objecting to this specific permit application. Part of it is the conservation easement question, which Luke's suggestion lodged in his mind and has been sitting there since. A formal easement on the eastern woodlot, placed through an accredited land trust, would permanently restrict any development on the property's eastern section and would create a legal conservation designation that the DNR would be required to factor into any future management decisions affecting the adjacent state land. It would not stop the current permit application, but it would protect the buffer between the state forest and the developed farm ground, such that no future decision Jeff or his heirs made about the property could undo. He has not called a land trust. Calling a land trust means explaining his motivation for wanting to conserve the woodlot, and the legitimate motivations, while real and true, are not the whole reason, and the whole reason requires a conversation that Jeff has not figured out how to have with a stranger. The institutional framework that might otherwise address what Jeff is dealing with does not have a pathway for it. The Wisconsin DNR manages the Flambeau River State Forest under a comprehensive management plan with species targets and population parameters: gray wolf, black bear, white-tailed deer, fisher, American marten, a list of documented and cataloged species. There is no category in that plan for an undocumented large bipedal predator. There is no protocol for a private landowner with 30 years of systematic field observation to report that data through. No form, no procedure, no designated reviewer who handles inquiries about creatures that do not appear in the department's classification system. A call to the DNR's Wildlife Division in Madison would end with the data being filed under the nearest available category, probably a note in the General Predator Inquiry Database, acknowledged and not followed up. The person taking that call would be doing their job correctly. The system would be working as intended. The gap between what Jeff knows and what the system can process is not a failure of the system. It is a failure of the available categories, which is a different problem and one with no administrative solution. Nobody would be making that call out of malice. The system would be doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is manage the species it has been given a mandate to manage. The species Jeff is describing does not exist within that mandate, and creating a new category for it would require a chain of documentation and institutional acknowledgement that nobody in the department's chain of command is prepared to initiate. Karen has understood this from the beginning of their marriage, understood it in the specific way that a person who came into a family's history from the outside and chose to stay understands things. Not with the same bone-level familiarity that Jeff carries from childhood, but with the clearer-eyed view that comes from having made a considered decision to inhabit the reality that someone you love is already living inside. She has never told Jeff to go public. She has never suggested that the notebooks should be sent to a researcher or a journalist, or the Wisconsin DNR. She has also never suggested they should be burned, or that the information should stop with them rather than reaching Luke when Luke was old enough. She has held the same position for 25 years. This is what the land contains. The land is yours to manage. You will manage it as your family has always managed it, and I will support whatever decision the management requires. That consistency is its own form of intelligence, and Jeff has leaned on it more heavily in the 6 weeks since the permit application than in all the previous years of their marriage combined. Jeff is the only person who can bridge the distance between what he knows and what the institutional frameworks that govern the land east of his property might actually be able to respond to. He is also the only person who fully understands what bridging that distance would cost him and what it might cost the territory he is trying to protect. The intelligence that the animal has demonstrated across 100 years of contact with the family is the element Jeff returns to most consistently when he tries to think clearly about the current situation and what it requires of him. His grandfather documented an animal that maintained a parallel trail through a ground blizzard alongside a man who needed to keep moving at a distance that kept the man aware of its presence without creating the kind of panic that might have sent him in the wrong direction. His mother documented an animal that used a human-built structure for its intended purpose, recognized a human approaching the structure, and left without damaging anything. A sequence that requires understanding the distinction between the structure, its normal occupants, and the specific human whose footsteps she heard crossing the yard. Jeff documented an animal that arrived at a beaver pond in December, when a person was in the water and produced a sound that broke that person's freeze response at the moment when the freeze response was keeping him from saving himself. And now the camera has recorded an animal that stood at a fence post for over 4 minutes facing a house, and the fence post carries marks at 4 feet and 11 inches that have no precedent in 30 years of the family's field documentation. Each of these behaviors, taken alone, can be accounted for by an explanation that does not require unusual intelligence. The blizzard parallel trail could be a coincidence of route. The barn use could be opportunistic shelter seeking. The beaver pond vocalization could be a territorial sound unrelated to the human in the water. The fence post marks could be incidental. The 4-minute facing of the house could be the behavior of an agitated animal pressing the boundary of its territory under stress. But taken together, across 3 generations of observation by people who spent their entire adult lives learning to read animal behavior in the specific landscape where these events occurred, the accumulated pattern does not suggest coincidence. It suggests an animal that has been paying sustained and systematic attention to a specific group of humans for a very long time, and making decisions about its behavior toward them based on that attention. Not decisions in the way humans use that word, not deliberation or reflection or planning in the cognitive sense, but decisions in the sense that an intelligent animal's behavior reflects its ongoing assessment of a complex situation, calibrated, context-sensitive, and modified by accumulated observation. The fence post marks at 4 feet and 11 inches are the piece of the current evidence that Jeff finds most difficult to account for without acknowledging the possibility of intentional communication. He has looked at territorial marks on trees. He has looked at stress behavior from multiple animal species under conditions of territory pressure. He has thought about it from every angle that 30 years of field experience gives him access to. And the 2 shallow parallel horizontal lines at human eye level on the south face of a weathered cedar fence post, made with what appears to be 2 fingers and not the full paw, are different from every other piece of territorial or stress behavior in the record. in ways that are specific and measurable, and not explained by any known animal behavior pattern he can access. He does not say it was communicating with him. He is honest about that and careful about it. He says the marks are at a height that a person would look at, in a configuration that a person would distinguish from the marks on the trees, and that they appeared on the same fence post where the camera recorded it standing for over 4 minutes facing the farmhouse. He says that is what the evidence shows, and he has spent 30 years trusting the evidence, rather than the conclusions he wanted to reach. The ethical position Jeff is in has no clean resolution. He is the custodian of information about a piece of wild land that matters to something he cannot formally document through any channel an institution can process. He is the third generation of a family that has been maintaining a coexistence arrangement with something that has not harmed them across 100 years of living on adjacent ground. And he is facing a situation in which the passive maintenance of that arrangement is no longer sufficient to protect what the arrangement has been protecting, because something is about to happen to the land east of the creek that the arrangement itself cannot prevent. The coexistence his grandfather stumbled into and his mother codified, and he has maintained for 30 years, has worked because the state forest provided the insulation the arrangement needed. The state forest east of the creek has been, for the better part of a century, exactly what its name suggests. Forest, managed for timber and wildlife and recreational use, with light human presence and no sustained industrial activity, in the sections where the territorial evidence concentrates. The mineral exploration permit changes that in the specific section of the forest that it has been using as its core territory, not with malice and not with awareness of what is there, but with the same indifference to what it does not know about that all development processes have to that category of things they cannot measure. Jeff is the only person in a position to say something relevant to that process. Whether he can say it while protecting the territory without exposing it to a different kind of threat is the question he has not yet been able to answer. 41 days from his first email to this channel, the public comment period on the Northland Meridian permit will close. He has not filed a comment. He has not called a land trust. He is still working through what the right answer is, and he is doing it with the same methodical care that Ezra brought to the morning after the blizzard, and Dorothy brought to the notebooks she kept for 30 years and locked in a closet shelf where no one would find them until she decided the time had come. Jeff checks the game camera every morning. In the 3 weeks since Luke drove away from the farm, the Dogman has appeared at the fence line twice more. The second appearance lasted a little over 2 minutes. The third was shorter. All 3 appearances were between 2 and 3 in the morning, on nights when the wind was from the east, blowing out of the state forest toward the house. He does not know if the wind direction is coincidence, or if an animal that understands where the camera is positioned would also understand that the wind direction affects how much of its approach the house can detect before it reaches the fence. He adds this to his log. He keeps the log in the same fireproof box where Dorothy's notebooks have sat since 2006, and where the record of Ezra's measurements from the morning after the blizzard of February 1951 has sat since Dorothy first put it there. He told us something in our last conversation that has stayed with us in the days since. He said his grandfather had worked alongside an animal he could not name for close to 30 years, and had concluded, when he finally told someone about it, that the animal's decision not to harm him was the most significant thing the entire experience had communicated. He said Ezra had phrased it in the plain way of a man who thought in practical terms and did not require anyone else to validate his conclusions. The fact that it left me alone told me more about what it was than anything else it could have done. Jeff said he had thought about that framing every day since Dorothy told it to him when he was a teenager. He said the question he was sitting with now was what it meant that the animal was no longer leaving him alone, and he said he did not think the question had a simple answer, but he believed it had a right one, and he was still working out whether he had the standing to give it. The regional record outside of Linda Godfrey's published work includes a cluster of accounts from the late 1980s and early 1990s that came out of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, which runs north and east from the Flambeau River State Forest, through Ashland and Vilas and Oneida counties. These accounts were largely collected by field researchers working independently of Godfrey in the same period, and were never formally published, but were shared within the reporting community. In the years after Godfrey's Bray Road work attracted enough public attention, to give people a framework for what they were reporting. The consistent elements across these northern Wisconsin accounts were the same elements that appeared in the Bray Road cluster: large upright canine, waterway association, nighttime movement, territorial restraint, rather than predatory aggression. One account from a trapper working the Chequamegon in the early 1990s described an encounter at a beaver pond in February, where a large upright shape had been visible at the far bank for several minutes before moving north into Placebound. The timber, without investigating the trapper's equipment. The trapper estimated the height at over 7 feet based on the brush height at the bank. He had measured the brush the following morning to confirm the estimate. The location was roughly 60 miles northeast of the family property in Price County. The question of what its range actually encompasses is one that the family's records alone cannot answer. Jeff's documentation is specific to a territory that the animal has maintained in a stable configuration for as long as the record extends. The territorial markers on the eastern woodlot trees have been refreshed in the same location, at the same heights, on the same line of trees, for over 70 years of documented observation. The creek crossing has been used consistently for the same period. The granite outcrop on the ridgeline was identified as a denning site in the 1950s and has not been approached since. But what evidence is visible from a safe distance suggests it has remained in use. This is an animal that is not transient. It is resident in a specific territory and has been resident there for at least a century by the family's observation. Whether it is the same individual throughout that period is the question Dorothy's comparison tables were building toward when she died, and that Jeff has been extending the data on since. The stride length stability across 70-plus years of measurement is the most compelling piece of evidence for continuity of individual. The range is too consistent across too long a period to be easily explained by sequential individuals. 2 or 3 different animals occupying the same territory across a century would be expected to show more variation in individual physical dimensions than the family's measurements show. The data looks more like one very old animal than like a succession of animals of similar but not identical size. Dorothy was the first to say this plainly in her notebooks, in an entry from the mid-1990s where she wrote, "The consistency of the stride data across 45 years of measurement is the most difficult piece of the record to account for within normal assumptions about mammalian lifespan." She did not attempt to account for it. She wrote it down and moved on. The question of longevity connects directly to the indigenous traditional accounts and the role that the Anishinaabe categorization of boundary beings plays in understanding what the family has been living alongside. A boundary being in the Ojibwe tradition is not bound by the same constraints that define ordinary animal existence, and that includes the temporal constraints. The oral tradition does not assign a specific lifespan to these beings. It assigns a specific relationship to place. They are associated with particular territories across generations of human memory, and the consistency of their presence in those territories over very long periods of time is a feature of the category, rather than an anomaly within it. When Godfrey asked whether the beings she was documenting were the same individuals that people had been encountering for decades, or whether the territory was being maintained by successive individuals, the response she most consistently received from elders who would speak to the question was that the distinction was not the relevant one. The territory is what it is. What maintains the territory is what it is. The Western demand for individual identity and continuity across time is a frame that does not map cleanly onto what the Anishinaabe tradition is describing. Jeff finds this framing useful without finding it definitive. He is a farmer with a background in practical field observation, and the idea that the distinction between individual continuity and territorial continuity is not the relevant one sits uncomfortably alongside 30 years of stride length data. But he also recognizes that Dorothy's stride length data, however carefully collected and however compelling its implications, has not produced an answer. He holds both things without forcing a conclusion, which is consistent with how the family has always handled the evidence, carefully, without commitment to a framework that the data does not fully support. What lives in the state forest east of the family property has been in that country since before the property existed. It was in the Flambeau River drainage when Ezra came to Price County in the early 1920s and found his parcel of cut-over ground and decided to spend the rest of his life making something from it. It was there when Dorothy was born in the farmhouse in 1936. It was there on a February afternoon in 1951 when a Norwegian farmer got turned around in a ground blizzard and something walked alongside him in the trees until he saw the light from his barn. It was there when Dorothy sat in the woodlot on a July evening in 1974, and a shape at the balsam tree line looked at her for 10 seconds and then turned back into the timber. It was there in December of 1989 when it came to the north bank of a frozen beaver pond at speed and made a sound that put a hypothermic 17-year-old onto the ice. It has been there for every year of Jeff's adult life on the farm, marking the same trees in the same section of the woodlot at the same heights, crossing the creek in the soft mud seasons, maintaining a territory that has remained stable across the better part of a century of observation. The thing that distinguishes the family's situation from every other documented Dogman account in the Wisconsin record, and possibly from every documented account anywhere in the Great Lakes region, is that the relationship has been two-directional. It has not been hiding. It has been coexisting. It has been moving through a territory that happens to include the eastern edge of a working farm, and the people who work that farm have understood, passed down through 3 generations, like a piece of equipment or a farming technique, or a knowledge of which hollows hold water and which slopes drain well, that the coexistence requires a form of mutual restraint that neither party has ever needed to formalize, because it has worked without formalization for 100 years. Ezra's restraint was practical and unself-conscious. He farmed his ground, and he stayed out of the eastern sections after dark, and he kept his peace. Dorothy's restraint was systematic and documented. 30 years of notebooks, annual photography of the territorial markers, careful management of the boundaries and the information about them. Jeff's restraint has been both of these, and something more. 30 years of managing the knowledge of what lives in the state forest east of his property, in a county where everyone knows everyone's business, maintaining the boundaries, maintaining the silence, and adding to the record that 3 generations of his family have been building. The restraint on the other side of the fence has been equally consistent. The tracks at the creek crossing, year after year, the refreshed marks on the woodlot trees, fall after fall, the 3 times the vocalization came from the state forest in 30 years, low and structured and directed, each time noted and not responded to, and the long history of encounters with 3 generations of this family that have produced no injury, no property damage, no escalation. The encounter ended. The shape went back into the timber. The family went back to the farmhouse, and the arrangement continued. The fence post marks at 4 feet and 11 inches are the first thing in 100 years that does not fit comfortably into the arrangement as it has always worked. They are the first indication from the other side of the fence that the arrangement itself, the passive restraint, and the mutual space, and the stable coexistence that has served both parties across 3 generations, may not be adequate to the situation that is developing. And Jeff is sitting with that, the way his family has always sat with difficult things, carefully, without imposing a conclusion before it is warranted, and with full awareness that the decision he makes in the next few weeks is one that cannot be unmade. The North Fork of the Flambeau River runs south through Price County, the way it has always run south through Price County, over the same glacial gravel, under the same canopy of cedar and hemlock and balsam fir. It does not know about mineral exploration permits, or conservation easements, or the decision one man in his early 50s is working through in a farmhouse in Ogama. The river does not know that on a fence post at the edge of the backfield, 2 shallow parallel lines pressed into weathered cedar at 4 feet and 11 inches are waiting for a response. The river has been running through this country since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, and it will be running through it long after whatever decision Jeff makes has played out to whatever conclusion it reaches. He checks the camera in the morning. He has a few more weeks to decide, and in the state forest east of the creek crossing, on the ridgeline where the territorial markers have been refreshed every fall for longer than the family can account for, under a sky that is beginning to carry the first light before it is fully dark, something that has been part of the Flambeau River country since before any human structure stood on this ground, continues to move through its territory at its own pace, aware of the farm on the other side of the woodlot fence, in the way it has been aware of it across 3 generations of the same family, and carrying the particular patience of something that has been sharing this country with humans for a very long time, and has learned that humans, when they understand what they are looking at, sometimes make the right decision. The marks are on the fence post. The camera is recording. Jeff is still looking at the evidence. He will decide what the evidence requires. The thing that nobody tells you about carrying a piece of knowledge for this long is what it does to your relationship with time. Jeff said this to us near the end of our last conversation, in the way that people say things they have been thinking about for years without having had anyone to say them to. He said growing up with this knowledge, being the third person in a sequence of people who had held it and then passed it forward, had given him a specific sense of his own position in the long run of things that he could not fully separate from the knowledge itself. He was part of a lineage, not of land ownership or farming practice, though he was part of those too, but of attention, a chain of people who had looked at the same terrain from the same position and seen the same thing and understood that what they were seeing required careful handling and a long view. Ezra had taken the long view because he was a practical man who understood that the quality of your relationship to a piece of land is determined by what you are willing to observe and what you are willing to act on. He had observed the evidence and acted on it with the only tool he trusted, his direct field experience, translated into habits and passed down. Dorothy had taken the long view because she was a methodical woman who understood that evidence without documentation is a story, and documentation without a recipient is a box in a closet, and she had spent 30 years making sure the documentation was worthy of a recipient, and that the recipient was worthy of the documentation. Jeff has taken the long view because he inherited both the habits and the documentation, and understands what they add up to and what that sum requires of him. He is the first person in 3 generations of the family who has had to make a decision. Ezra did not make a decision. He arrived at an arrangement and maintained it. Dorothy did not make a decision in the active sense. She deepened the arrangement and extended the record. Jeff has maintained both of those inheritances for 30 years without being required to do anything beyond maintain them. The mining permit changes that. The fence post marks change that. The footage and the tracks in the field, and the 4 minutes and 23 seconds of a large dogman standing at the fence with its face toward the house change that. The passive maintenance of an arrangement is no longer the full picture of what the situation requires. What the situation requires is what Jeff is still working out, and the working out is harder than anything in the previous 30 years of maintenance has been, because the previous 30 years did not require him to make a choice that the next 30 years would have to live inside. The comment period on the permit closes in 41 days from his first contact with this channel. The land trust option exists, and Karen has researched it, and the conservation easement process is straightforward for a property with the eastern woodlot's ecological characteristics. Luke has not called. Karen is patient in the way she has always been patient with this. She has her position, which is the practical one, and she has stated it clearly, and she is waiting for Jeff to reach his own conclusion in his own time, while the deadline ticks forward. Jeff told us one more thing in our last conversation. He said that in all the years he had been farming the property and managing the knowledge and checking the marks in October and the tracks in March, he had never thought of it as his responsibility. It was a presence. It was something that lived in the state forest east of the creek crossing and had maintained its own territory for longer than the family had maintained theirs. His responsibility was to the arrangement, not to the animal. The arrangement was what Ezra had arrived at, and Dorothy had codified, and Jeff had maintained. And the arrangement was its own complete thing. Mutual restraint, mutual space, a century of undisturbed coexistence. He had not been responsible for the animal. He had been responsible for his side of the fence. The fence post marks at 4 feet and 11 inches are the first moment in 100 years where that framing has felt insufficient. 2 shallow parallel lines pressed into weathered cedar at human eye level. On the post, the camera recorded the animal standing at for over 4 minutes. Made with a specificity different from every other mark in 30 years of documentation. They are not territorial. They are not stress behavior. They are at a height that a person walking up to that fence post would look at, in a number of lines that a person would distinguish from the 4-line territorial marks on the woodlot trees, pressed with a force that a person would recognize as precise rather than emphatic. They are on the south face of the post. The south face is the face that looks toward the house. Jeff has not decided what they mean. He has not decided what they require of him. He is sitting with the evidence the way his mother taught him to sit with evidence, without forcing a conclusion before the data supports one, without committing to a framework before the data fills it, without acting on a hypothesis before the observation period is complete. He is checking the camera in the morning. He is walking the woodlot fence when the conditions hold impressions. He is reading the eastern tree line at dusk the way he has been reading it since he was 13 years old, with the patience of someone who has been taught that the land will tell you what you need to know if you look at it long enough without deciding in advance what you expect to find. The North Fork of the Flambeau River is running south through Price County this morning, the same way it has been running south through Price County for the full span of human memory in this part of Wisconsin. The ground is frozen, and the timber is bare, and the sky over the ridge to the east is the color of pewter in the hour before the light comes. The territorial marks on the eastern fence line trees are the same marks that Ezra first identified in 1952. The creek crossing is the same ford that Dorothy first measured in the winter of 1980. The granite outcrop on the ridgeline is the same outcrop that has been showing signs of use for longer than the family's documentation extends. And somewhere in the state forest on the other side of that creek crossing, on ground that has not changed its essential character since the last glacial retreat, something that has been part of this landscape for longer than any human structure in Price County has been standing, is moving through its territory this morning, with the same unhurried attention it has brought to this ground for as long as the family has been keeping records of what it does. The marks are on the fence post. The camera is recording. Jeff is still looking at the evidence. The comment period closes in 41 days. He will decide what the evidence requires. We have reviewed the footage. We have read the measurements. We have spent time with a family's 100 years of careful, grounded observation of a territory that does not appear in any official record. Whatever walks the ridgeline east of the creek in Price County has not asked to be documented. It has maintained a boundary and kept its side of an arrangement that nobody signed and nobody formalized. And nobody needs to formalize for it to be real. Jeff is going to figure out what the evidence requires. We believe him when he says that. The marks are on the fence post. He has 41 days.